Hey sophomores, let's start our vocab for chapter 24. Our first word is the Great Game. The Great Game was an intense rivalry that occurred between Russia and Great Britain, where they were both trying to get influence into Central Asian countries. Now, when I say Central Asian countries, they're often referred to as the Stand countries. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, all of these. Britain had the interest because they were trying to have a buffer or protect their jewel of their colonies, India. And Russia, being right here, wanted to gain more influence in the world and spread their influence. So it's a rivalry between Britain and Russia in this time period. Imperialism is basically looking at empire building, or a country trying to extend its influence and its power, often by military force. So imperialism in this time period was often countries of Europe at this time, also Japan as well, taking over other lands. Very, very similar to colonialism. Colonialism, you'll want to think more in our last era, in the early modern era. That was done more by, when we think like the Spanish and the British. In Latin America, we saw a lot of colonialism. So other places too, but think more, associate colonialism with Latin America. Associate more imperialism, more with industrialization, weapons like the machine gun, Africa and Asia, India being taken over during imperialism. The scramble for Africa was the occupation, dividing, and colonization of African territory by European powers. This occurred from 1881 to 1914, also called the Partition of Africa. But this is when we will see Africa gets basically divided and taken over by European powers at this time. And you can see here almost the entire continent is taken over by European powers, except for Liberia and Ethiopia. What really allows this to happen is new technology, like the machine gun, for instance, which allows Europeans to get into the interior and lay down railroad tracks and really take over more of this land, which they weren't able to do in previous eras. The Sepoy Mutiny, or revolt, was led by Sepoys, who were Indians who were in the British military. So after Britain had taken over India, these were Indians who had enlisted in the British military, and they revolted and rebelled against the British. Why'd they rebel? They were given cartridges for their guns, their muskets to fire, and they had to open them up with their teeth to tear them, is how they were instructed, and to put them in their gun. Well, these cartridges were lined with both cow and pig fat, which for people in India, who Hindus are vegetarians, they don't eat meat, so for them it was against their religion. And for Muslims, the fact that it was pork fat or pig fat is against their religion. So when this was found out, they rebelled against the British. And it wasn't just this, it was also many other things of the British looking down upon them, demeaning them, and not treating them as equals. And this led to a large mutiny and revolt, which will end up having the British take more control in India directly from the government. Raj is the rule or government, sometimes taken as like a king. Here it is also referred to as when the British ruled in India. We would call it the British Raj or the English Raj, which ruled in India in this era. The Congo Free State, as it was called, was actually ruled by Belgium. Even more so, was ruled by one person named King Leopold, who was the ruler in Belgium. In the Congo Free State, King Leopold was able to convince the world he was trying to work kind of as a nonprofit to help bring up the people of Congo. When the sad reality was, in the Congo Free State, they were really trying to get resources, especially rubber, out of Congo, and they were basically using and enslaving the people of the Congo and committed a mass genocide, which ended up in the death of millions of people in the Congo. And the name of the territory at this time that they called was the Congo Free State. The Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 was a conference where basically the powers of Europe came together and decided not to fight against each other, but decided how they would divide up Africa amongst themselves. And this will basically kind of lead to what we saw in the partition of Africa, where we see Africa is divided into between many different European powers. Abyssinia was another name for the modern-day country of Ethiopia. And what's really significant about this land is it was never taken over by European powers. So Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia, was never taken over, and that meant that no European imperialism happened in this area. Liberia is a modern-day country in West Africa, and it was also never formally imperialized by a European power. However, Liberia is an interesting country because it was started with the help of the United States. And this was actually a land where people who had escaped slavery or were no longer enslaved in the Americas, so Africans who were no longer enslaved, who had lived in the Americas for a while, were able to return and live in Africa. So in the country of Liberia today, you have some people who are the ancestors of people who were slaves in America or the Americas. And you also have some people who are native to Liberia who never left as well. So both populations live there today in Liberia. The Zulu Kingdom was a kingdom that was established in southern Africa. The Zulu Kingdom were known very much for having a very strong military and using their short spear and battle tactics at this time. They also were resistors of the British and other Europeans who came in, actually getting some victories against both the Dutch Afrikaners and the British forces who came in before eventually losing to them and having their land taken away. But they are known for their resistance, their organization, and their military in southern Africa. The Anglo Zulu War was a war fought in 1879 between British forces and the Zulu forces of southern Africa. Now the British eventually do win and are able to take over Zulu land, but the Zulu put up a fierce resistance and were able to win some battles against the British, even though the British had a definite technological advantage with their guns and weapons. The Boer Wars were fought over southern African territory, and the Boers were referring to basically the Dutch Afrikaners, or white people, came in from the Netherlands into Africa and took over much land. Then the British came after them and were able to take this land away from the Dutch. In the Boer Wars, the British were able to defeat the Dutch for control over southern Africa. The Roosevelt Corollary was basically signed by United States President Theodore Roosevelt as a way for the United States to say that they have access power in South America. Basically what it states is that the United States was going to be the protector of the lands in the Americas to make sure that they had good governments. And it continued something earlier called the Monroe Doctrine, which was to keep other European powers out of the Americas. By that I mean like anything from Mexico and south, like Central America and South America. And others would say it was a way for the United States to get more involved in Latin America and to increase their power, and some would even argue it was a show of imperialism. What it does is if basically there is instability or something happens in a government anywhere in Central or South America, the United States could get involved with military, with business, and other means. The Indian National Congress started in 1885, and this was really an organized movement that came together to fight for Indian independence, to be free from the British Raj or British power in India. Pan-Africanism is the idea that people of African descent basically share a common heritage, a common history, and therefore should work together to advance African culture all together, whereas people who were brought from the African diaspora, brought from Africa to the Americas, or people in Africa itself. It was fighting to end the slave trade and to stop the colonization and imperialism of Africa from foreign, especially, well, as you saw, especially from the European powers that divided it up. An export economy is an economy that depends on exporting goods or selling goods to other people. Basically, that means they want to make goods, produce goods, and sell them out, and their economy becomes very reliant upon international trade or trade with other nations around the world. Cecil Rhodes was a man who had a lot of power in Africa when it came to mining, trying to get resources out of the country. And Cecil Rhodes is even most famous for wanting to build a railway all the way from South Africa to Egypt, where they would be able to get a railroad going all the way. And his main purpose for this was to get the natural resources, raw materials, and goods out of the country. So he was definitely someone who was pro-imperialism and wanted to get as many resources out of Africa as possible. Gao and Pondicherry were trade cities that were established in India. Gao was established by the Portuguese, and Pondicherry was established by France. Both these cities were just basically a way of showing that Britain wasn't the only power in India, that in this era both Portugal and France had a little bit of power in India still. Indentured servants or indentured labor. We've talked about this quite a bit in the class. Indentured servants are people who work for their passage to a new land. So it's something like you will work for like 4 to 7 years on a new land, and then you'll become free and you'll be able to live there. This happened with people from India during this time period, as they would go to many parts over the world, even Southern Africa, even in South America, in places like Guyana. And what would happen is these laborers would be brought, and many of them actually lived, ironically, in the same places where African slave labor lived before them. Indentured labor in India really started after the African slave trade was ruled illegal, and slave trade became illegal. What the British Empire did is, after they made slavery illegal, was they went and they got Indian labor that they brought as indentured labor, and they made work for 4 to 7 years for free, and then they could live in their new lands. Many of these indentured laborers did not survive the 4 to 7 years and died. However, many did, and this is why you will see communities of Indians, or people from India, in South Africa, in Guyana, in many other parts across the world. A penal colony, and no, this is not a dirty word. Pretty lame joke there. All right, so a penal colony, this is basically Australia, and a penal colony Australia was a land for people in England where to send their convicts or where to send their prisoners. And they would send them to Australia, where they would live a new life in Australia outside of England. So many of the white settlers who first settled Australia were actually convicts from the British Empire.